this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Fractal Lumen S24 RGB V2. And this is a wiring and setup guide where I'm going to show you how to install this all-in-one cooler, the logic to think about when installing it, where to install it, for example, how to wire up all the cables, how to control the RGB lighting, and some tests that you should probably carry out after the install once it's in your system. I also want to talk to you about the setup for both AMD AM5 socket motherboards and Intel LGA 1700 socket, and so I'm going to show the logic for that. Now, this cooler comes with two fans, as you can see, have a mass of cables, and that may be intimidating, but don't worry. It also has pre-applied thermal paste on the copper plate and is pre-filled with the coolant, so you don't need to worry about those things. Don't do what I've just done though and take that plastic cover off. I just did that to show you the thermal paste. You do not want to damage that thermal paste, so take care to leave that on until the last second to make sure it's protected during the setup process. Now, this cooler is interesting in a number of ways, one of which is that it has the pump actually inside the radiator. So you can see the rad here, and we're going to need to install the fans on that in a second. But that's where the pump system is actually located, which is fairly unusual because usually it's in the CPU block. But this actually has some benefits in terms of the wiring and also the placement of the rad, because it means that you can set it up so that it is into your system really well. And obviously also it's pushing liquid around from the radiator itself, which just means the longevity should be pretty good with it. Now, included in the box, you get a number of different things, which also includes extra thermal paste, which is great if you need to rejuvenate it in future, or if you do make a mistake, as I do later in the video, damaging the thermal paste that's included. You'll see that the radiator has a single cable coming out of it for the pump control, and I'll talk to you about the wiring on that later on. But it's important to note this, because obviously you need to make sure that's plugged in, otherwise the system won't work properly, and you need to think about the orientation of it. The same with the fans. You've seen from the initial clips that I installed this on the top of the case in the Fractal North case to exhaust out of there. And you need to think about the logic of where you're going to install this radiator and what it's going to look like, where the tubes are going to go, for example. So I'm thinking about that now and the process for it, basically just trying to think about the logic of it. So I'm going to top mount it in that case because it's the most logical way to do it in this particular case. But you'll see you have the option to put the tubes at the rear of the case or at the front of the case, and then orient the CPU block in whatever direction you want. You can actually adjust the cap on that as well, so you can make it look nicer in your system. And it's fairly straightforward to do this. The thought process is whether you're going to put a fan at the rear of the case, for example, and is that going to interfere with the tubes, or whether the tubes at the front would look better, or whether that's going to get in the way of any RAM that you might have installed, and thoughts like that. You also then need to think about obviously the orientation, because that's going to make a difference to how the fans are wired up. So when installing the fans, we need to think about the direction those cables are going to run, because obviously ideally you want to run them to the rear of the case so you can hide them away and make things look a bit neater. Now I'm installing these face up towards me, which will be face down in towards the case. And that's because the logo is where the air is pulled from, so it will pull it from inside the case and then push it out through the radiator. Now, I've done a guide separately on the best orientation for all-in-one coolers, so I'll link to that in the description. It's worth checking out. You may want to give some thought to how this is set up in your case, because it can make quite a difference whether you have these fans in intake or exhaust mode, depending on how you've got it set up. Thermal throttling may be a consideration, for example, and I'll show you how to look for that later on in the video. The fan wiring may look a bit intimidating when you first set it up. It's actually fairly straightforward. You'll see there are two cables coming out of each of these fans, but those themselves have extra cable connections on them, which can make it look a bit scary. But one cable is for RGB and one's for fan power, and it's actually simplified because they are daisy chainable, and that's what those extra connections are about. You'll see here, this is the fan power connection, for example. We have a male connector and a female one. That means that you can then run one fan power connection from one fan to the other. So rather than having to plug in multiple fan cables to your motherboard, you plug these two fans in together and then plug them into a single head on your motherboard, which then ensures the fans are powered by one controller, which means neater cables on your motherboard and also a simpler installation process. And that makes life a lot easier. If you've got a larger 360mm version of this cooler, you can also use that logic. You then have the RGB connection, which is a 3-pin connector that you'll see here with those pins coming out. And again, you've got male and female versions of those. And that's because you can also daisy chain the RGB connector. So from one fan to the next, you can connect up those cables. And now the RGB is therefore connected between those two. And then you just have to plug in the other cable into your motherboard. And I'll show you where in a second. You can also use that logic with the pump as well and other RGB fans included in the case. As you saw earlier on, I actually put some extra into the Fractal North, for example, and I linked up all of the cables so that the RGB was synced across all the fans. Now, the setup of the block that goes over the CPU is actually really simple because it only has one cable coming out of it, which is pretty unusual for an all-in-one cooler. But this is just for that RGB on the pump head. So it's a single small cable plugs in like that. And then you have, again, that 5-volt RGB connector, which is a 3-pin one. And as I said, what you want to do here is basically connect it into the chain that's coming out of the fans. So looping these all together so they're nicely connected up. I'm showing you this all now so that you can see it really easily rather than when it's inside the case, because it just makes it more visible. But obviously the logic for this will hopefully be carried through in a minute once we get to the build proper inside the case. But now you have it all set up. So in theory, the fan power is all set up and the RGB lighting, you just need to then connect it up to the motherboard once it's installed, and then it will all work nicely. So the logic for doing that is fairly straightforward, so not to worry. There are a couple of options that are worth bearing in mind though. So we'll talk about the RGB lighting first. What you're looking for is a 5-volt RGB header. In this instance, it's the JRGB V2 header on this MSI motherboard, which is in the top right. You may well find they're marked 5-volt RGB. You notice they're 3 pins, and you'll find them either on the top right or on the bottom left. Sometimes you'll find 2. You can see there's another one, for example, here next to the SATA port for the data connection for SSDs and hard disk drives, and you can connect that up like that. So you have options. The other connector is obviously for the fan power. Now, daisy chaining those cables together, as I showed earlier. So we just do that again. So those 2 fans are connected up together, and then the final connector for that then connects up to a couple of different options. Now, the instructions tell you to connect it up to a sys fan header. So this is a system fan header or a chassis fan header on the motherboard, which is essentially just fan control. Now, I personally think it'd be more logical to connect it to the CPU fan, because if you do that, that will then not give you the same errors that you might get from the BIOS other way, which is where the CPU and motherboard say, hold on a minute, why has my CPU not got a fan on it? Because you need a fan on there and it can cause some problems, and I think it's more logical. Then you have the pump cable, so that's the one coming out of the radiator. That would run to the all-in-one pump header on your motherboard. This may be labeled differently, but it's usually in the same place on the top right. You can see here that it's pump fan 1, but it may well be AIO pump or something similar. You'd look to connect those. So essentially the rad's connected to that, and then the fans on the rad are connected to the CPU fan. Now I'm going to quickly show you the AMD AM5 setup and what you would do. So I'm using this Gigabyte motherboard for that. And the good news is you essentially just use the bracketing that's pre-installed on there. So the usual traditional AM5 standoffs, and it's actually the same ones that were with AM4. Now, in this instance, I haven't got a CPU currently installed. Obviously, make sure you've got your CPU installed first, and it's in the case. But quickly again, I'll show you the logic for this. There's an extra bracket included in the box with this cooler that you can see here. It's kind of a horseshoe shape to it. It has these additional sort of screws that go into there that are essentially clips that will hold on to the bracketing on the motherboard. You have to pop those into the bottom on the underside there and then screw these standoffs in with thumb screws. And this is basically going to replace the bracketing that comes on the CPU block, because that's Intel as default. So you just need to work out the logic for that and then screw these in nice and tight so it's all secured nicely. And just follow as I've done there and secure that down. Notice the angle of which way around this is facing, because you obviously need to make sure that logic is the same when you're doing it. If you get it the wrong way around, it won't work. So now what you need to do is to remove that bracketing around the outside here, around the copper plate. So it just slides out, just gently pulls out, and then replace it with the AMD version of that. Take care not to damage the thermal paste while you're doing it, which you will notice I actually have done in this instance. I've accidentally rubbed it a little bit, so that's why I was saying be careful with it. And then when the CPU's on, and obviously when the motherboard's installed, you line up those clips that you saw on either side of that bracketing with the plastic clips above and below the CPU housing. You see that there, and then put that down and obviously secure those standoffs down, tighten up those thumb screws more, and then that will be secured and ready to go. Again, obviously don't do this without the CPU on there. I'm just demoing it so you can see easily. But that's a fairly easy install actually, but you do only have 2 secure points. Now with the Intel LGA 1700 setup, it's a slightly more complicated setup than the AM5. You need to first of all take this back plate and put these long standoff screws through it. They need to be lined up, and you'll notice that there's one sort of flat notch on the edge of these screws, so you need to line that up in the right way with the corners. Now for LGA 1700, it has to go to the far corners because it's quite a long shape to the CPU, so you need to make sure you push them into the far corners of each of the corners of this back plate. And then there are some washers that go down over the top to make sure it's secured nicely, because these need to be nice and tight so they're not loose when you seat the rest of it down over the top. And you'll see what I mean in a minute, but you'll also see that flat bit that I was talking about earlier on, and you'll notice when you look at the back plate how that lines up. So just put all 4 of those in, and then the washers go down over the top of that to secure it into place. Once that's done, we then need to access the back of the motherboard, and I'm doing this prep before I put it into the case because it's just a bit easier in most cases, because you can sometimes not access the back of the motherboard. So we line that up and push that through so that the holes are then filled with those standoffs, and you can see them poking through on the other side. And then what we have is another set of 4 washers, plastic standoffs, and you need to put those down over the top. Now you have to note the orientation of those, because what I've found is you have to put them on a certain way around. If you don't, they will be loose. So just take a look at those as you're putting them on and check that they aren't loose, because this top left one was the wrong way up. Basically a notching on the inside of that to watch out for, and push those in, and you need to make sure they're secured nicely. And then obviously installing the motherboard in the usual way, popping it into the case and securing it down with multiple screws. Now you can do a lot of these steps if you've already got the motherboard installed. The backplate access might be a bit tricky, but I just wanted to show you the basic process so that you can see a lot more easily. We've already got the radiator and things set up, so now we've got to work out the logic of this. Now in this case, there's not actually much room at the top above the motherboard for running the wires, which is not ideal. Usually you'd pass them through some holes at the top of the motherboard back into the rear of the case and tidy them up a little bit there, and work out then where you're going to plug those in, as I showed you earlier on. This is not going to be so easy here, so I'm actually having to think about the wiring and where they're going. Obviously take note though that, as I said, these wires are pointing towards the back of the case, because you will want to make sure that that's the case. You don't want them dangling down in the front, especially if you've got a glass panel there. So at this point, because there's not going to be much room in here, I'm actually connecting up the cables now. So we're starting with that AIO pump header from the radiator to make sure that's set up, and I'm also putting on a little tiny extra bit of thermal paste simply because I damaged the thermal paste that was pre-applied. If you didn't, then you don't need to worry about that. Just put your cooler down on top of the CPU with its thermal paste as it is. But as I said, I've just done that because I did do a little bit of damage to that, and you don't want to cause cooling problems by having bad thermal paste coverage. So then I'm just going to place this in now and secure it so that nothing gets damaged, and then I can go about finalizing the install. Now you could, in theory, install the radiator, then the pump, but I'm going to do it the other way around just for ease of use and make it easier for you to see. And this is going to vary from case to case. You might have more room to negotiate these things in, but we're just setting that up now. And then there's 4 thumb screws that need to be secured over the standoff screws that we installed earlier on. So put those into the 4 corners, starting one corner and then go to the opposite one. So bottom left, top right, for example, and that will then help ensure even pressure as you're doing this. You do need to take care to make sure these are secured nicely, and they may well need tightening with a screwdriver, but be careful not to over tighten them, so you don't want to put too much pressure on there. But also if they're too loose, there will not be good contact between the copper plate and the CPU, which may result in your CPU getting too hot. So now we're looking to sort out the installation of the radiator on the top of the case, and there are some small screws that are used to secure that. But while doing that, I noticed obviously an excess of cables that I'm going to have to deal with. You can't just throw these into the case and hope for the best. We need to make sure they're tucked away nicely and aren't going to cause any problems where they touch on the fans or other things. So basically trying to secure these. Now obviously I'm also going to be plugging them in, so I need to plug in the CPU fan ones and the RGB connectors as well. And as you can see, once we've mounted the radiator, it is going to be a bit more fiddly, so it's something to bear in mind. But I also wanted to tidy these cables up. Now, because I've daisy chained them together already, so I've connected them up as I showed you earlier on, I realised that I could probably just get away with using some cable ties on here to basically just tie these cables together and neaten this up a bit. This will mean that the space will be a bit better optimized, so I would recommend doing this. It is fairly straightforward to do. Hopefully you've got some cable ties knocking around from the rest of the build, whether it's case cable ties, power supply cable ties, or just generally. But you can use these and you can buy them cheaply as well if you haven't got any, and then that will hopefully make things a little bit neater. If you've got a different case, you might not have this problem because you could just run these cables at the back of the case and hide them away. But because they're mostly going to be burning at the front, I wanted to make it a bit neater and tidy those up, and then obviously trim the cable ties down so that they're not going to get in the way either. But you can see now those cables are going to be a lot easier to manage, and should one be less visible and two not get in the way of anything important during the build process or afterwards as well. So that's set up, and then we're going to secure the radiators to the top and also run those cables. And don't forget to plug those in, it's obviously important. We get the CPU fan connections in, the AIO pump header and the 5V RGB header. It's just much easier to do now before you've mounted the radiator, because otherwise it's going to be really fiddly unless you've got tiny fingers or you're far less clumsy than I am. So just popping it onto the top of the case, and then we're going to secure it with the tiny screws that are included. There are multiple screws included in there that will need to plug in, that will need to screw into the top of the radiator, passing through the case and into that. And you'll see if you line it up nicely that you should have the right number of holes to be able to do that. You can also adjust the positioning of it. You'll see that I've actually got the rad orientated a little bit towards the left here. You could potentially move it a little bit over. You may want to shift it around in the case depending on how much room you've got in your case and the setup there, and you might have more space to be able to do this, but you can see that. Now also notice the orientation of the cable coming out of the rad as well, because it's actually pointing towards the back of the case, so that is adjustable. You can position that quite nicely so that everything's nice and neat and it's not being squashed or in the way. And then what I'm trying to do here is basically hide away some of those cables where they're a little bit longer and unsightly towards the rear. The other thing to note though, as I said, is that because of the daisy chaining of the RGB connections, so from fan to pump, you can also use that connector to connect to other fans. So I have 4 more RGB fans that are going in this case, and you can daisy chain those into that system as well. Don't connect up the fan power from them though. I wouldn't recommend daisy chaining multiple fans into a single fan header. 2 in one fan header is fine. 3 is probably also fine, but 4, 5, 6 or more would definitely be problematic. But for the RGB lighting, it is fine, and it will then ensure that you've got a syncing of the RGB lighting throughout. Now, the RGB in this case will be controlled by MSI's Mystic Light software, which I'll show you later on. You'd use your relevant motherboard software for the RGB control, in case you're wondering, unless you have a separate RGB controller. So now you can see what that looks like when I've neatened up those cables a bit and how they're tucked away, and obviously it looks a little bit better. And then, as I said, you can then run those cables around and connect up those 5V RGB connectors at the rear, and just make sure that that is connected to the motherboard, or at least one point of it is, so that it definitely works and is set up properly. And then it should all be logically done. Assuming you've wired up the rest of your PC correctly, you should then be able to power it on. By the way, if you're not sure, I've got a detailed wiring guide on all the different connections you'd make in a PC that I'll link to in the description, that you can check out if you're unsure about how to connect to the rest of it. But you can see now we've got that RGB working on the fans and on the pump as well. And something to bear in mind, depending on how you've orientated your pump, is that you can actually pop the cap off. So you can pop the cap off with the logo, and then you can adjust it into the various different positions. So you can actually have that logo on the top or on the side or on the bottom. So depending on which way around you put your tubes, you can actually change the design of the Fractal logo and the positioning of it. So that's really handy. But you can see the RGB is working as default across all of these things, and then we can customize it within the software. Now, once it is installed, obviously we're checking to make sure everything is working properly and spinning up nicely and lighting up nicely. But in a minute, I want to show you how to change the RGB lighting and also some other things that are worth checking once you get into Windows and do some tests to make sure it all looks as it should and is running nicely too. So to control the RGB lighting, you need relevant motherboard software. In this case, it's Mystic Light, which is part of MSI Center, previously MSI Dragon Center. And that's actually a module that you can install on that will then let you control the RGB lighting. Now, this will work for any RGB device that's connected to the motherboard, including, as you can see, Fractal's RGB fans that I have on the side of the case and the pump head, as well as the fans on the radiator. It gives you a number of different RGB controls, which includes both game sync as well as light sync in general and ambient lighting, which means it'll sync up with other MSI products and recognized ones. You can choose from various different modules in there, including the RGB on your RAM if you have any, and then on the motherboard itself. And you'll see that you can choose from the drop down, including the JRGB header that we set up earlier on, or all the RGB headers on the motherboard. You can then cycle through various different lighting effects, adjusting the brightness and the speed of the lighting. Now, obviously, this is just for MSI, but you will find other motherboards have similar software included in the motherboard software. For example, Asus Armory Crate has one that you can use, and you could potentially look at Signal RGB or something similar as an alternative. But you can see that it all syncs up nicely and runs across there. Now, for testing purposes, I just want to show you something else. So I'm using an Intel Core i5 14600K for this setup, and I wanted to show you one important thing that is worth doing once you've installed the system and set it all up. So this is using Intel Extreme Tuning Utility, and what I'm going to do here is essentially use this to test the CPU and make sure we're not thermal throttling. This is a good idea because it's essentially checking your system performance after all this install. So Extreme Tuning Utility will show you all the system information, including letting you check that your RAM's working as expected and XMP's working fine. But you can also use the stress test system that you can see here specifically on the CPU. So if you've got an Intel CPU, you can put it under this stress testing, run it alongside hardware info64, or just get data straight out of XTU itself so you can see the package temperatures and the frequency of the E cores and P cores there, and the overall temps in hardware info64 on the right, or hardware monitor. And that enables you to just run those tests to make sure that the CPU isn't getting too hot. You can see that this CPU has passed, so the setup has been perfectly fine with the Fractal Lumen, but it is worth checking because it could be something like your CPU fans or thermal paste isn't great, which could be causing throttling. I've done a video separately on this that's worth checking out, but now you can just enjoy the Fractal North in all its glory. If you want to see this case and the full build, check out the links in the description. And if you've enjoyed this video or found it useful, please subscribe, comment, and give me a nice like to help support the channel. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.